This story is titled, I Overheard My Brother-in-Law and His Fiancée Plotting to Humiliate Me at My Wedding. So I turned the tables and ruined their big day instead. Alright, let me start with a little background because you need to understand just how much James's brother, Brad, has been a pain in the neck for as long as I've known him. I'm Kelly, 24, and I'm recently got married, to James, who's 25. We've been together since high school, and James is honestly the best thing that's ever happened to me. He's kind, hardworking, and just an overall amazing guy. But his brother Brad? Let's just say the guy is the human equivalent of a thorn stuck in your shoe. Annoying, painful, and impossible to ignore. Brad is 27, and for as long as James can remember, he's always been the golden child in the eyes of their parents. You know the type. He's the older sibling who gets away with everything. Growing up, James told me that Brad was the kind of kid who would break something, blame it on James, and somehow get away with it every time. Boys will be boys, their mom would say. It wasn't just little things either. Brad would actively go out of his way to make James's life miserable. If James got a new toy for his birthday, Brad would take it and break it. If James made a new friend, Brad would swoop in, charm them, and make James feel like the outsider. As they got older, it didn't get any better. Brad would pick on James in front of his friends, calling him things like mama's boy or softy, because James wasn't into the whole macho brooding persona Brad had going on. James, being the good guy he is, tried to brush it off, but I could tell it bothered him. Who wouldn't be hurt when your own brother treats you like crap? Now, Brad's life is, well, it's a mess. He hops from one dead-end job to another, because he can't hold down a position for more than a few months. He's the kind of guy who walks into work late and acts surprised when he gets called out for it. He has this cocky attitude, like he's too good for rules or responsibilities. But somehow, their parents still make excuses for him. Brad's just figuring things out, they'll say, as if being an inconsiderate jerk is a phase he'll eventually grow out of. When it comes to relationships, Brad's track record is even worse. He's had more girlfriends than I can count, and every single one of them left him for good reason. Brad has this ability to charm women at first. He's got the looks, the smooth talk, and that fake confidence that draws people in. But once they're hooked, he shows his true colors. He's controlling, manipulative, and an expert at gaslighting. Alright, so let me tell you about the moment Stephanie entered the picture about 6 months ago. Because trust me, it was a game changer. Before her, Brad's girlfriends were like revolving doors. Here one day, gone the next. It was almost like a running joke in James's family. Every holiday or family event, Brad would show up with someone new, introduce them like they were the love of his life, and then a couple of months later, it was like they never existed. But Stephanie? Oh, she was different. Not in a good way, though. From the moment Brad introduced her at a family BBQ, it was clear this wasn't your average short-term fling. She had this air about her, like she thought she was better than everyone else in the room. And the way she looked at people? It wasn't curiosity or friendliness. It was pure judgment, like she was scanning the crowd for someone to pick apart. The first thing Stephanie said to me wasn't even a greeting. She walked up to where I was standing with James and said, "Oh, you're Kelly? I thought you'd be taller." I was so thrown off that I just laughed awkwardly, but James immediately went into protective mode. He gave her a look and said, "She's perfect the way she is." Stephanie just smirked and muttered, "I was just saying." That set the tone for how she interacted with everyone. She had this way of making snide comments that sounded like compliments if you weren't paying attention. Like when she told James's mom, "You must have been stunning when you were younger. Brad always says you were the prettiest woman in town." Or when she asked James's dad if he was finally going to retire and enjoy life, knowing full well he'd just been laid off. The worst part? Brad ate it up. He stood by her side, grinning like she was the most brilliant, charming woman in the world. For the first time, he seemed genuinely proud of the woman he was with, which made sense because they were basically the same person. They both loved stirring the pot and making themselves the center of attention. Stephanie wasn't just a mean girl, though. She was calculated. You could tell she studied people, figured out their insecurities, and then used them to her advantage. Over the next few months, every time we saw her, she managed to create drama without ever being directly involved. She'd plant little seeds of doubt or gossip, then sit back and watch the chaos unfold. One time, during a family dinner, she casually mentioned how James must have been such a mama's boy growing up, because he was so kind and sensitive. She said it like it was a compliment, but Brad jumped on it, laughing and saying, "Oh, you don't even know the half of it. He used to cry if mom didn't cut the crusts off his sandwiches." The whole table laughed, but I could see James was uncomfortable. Stephanie just smiled sweetly, like she had no idea she'd started it. She also had a habit of trying to one-up people. If someone mentioned a new job or accomplishment, Stephanie would find a way to make it about her or Brad. Like when James told the family he'd gotten a promotion at work. Everyone was genuinely happy for him, except Stephanie. She immediately turned to Brad and said, "Didn't you almost get promoted last year, babe? You totally should have if your boss wasn't such an idiot." It was like she couldn't stand the idea of anyone else getting attention. What really sealed my opinion of Stephanie, though, was when she started hanging out with James's mom more. At first, it seemed innocent. She'd join her for lunch or shopping trips, and I thought maybe she was just trying to get closer to the family. But then James's mom started acting different. She'd make these little comments about how James should call more often, or how it was so nice that Brad always stayed in touch, which was a total lie. Brad only called when he needed something. I later found out from James's sister Emma that Stephanie had been subtly comparing the two brothers during her hangouts with their mom. She'd say things like, "It's so sweet how Brad always talks about how much he loves you," or "Brad was just saying how he wants to make sure you're taken care of when you get older." All lies, of course, but it worked. James's mom started seeing Brad in a more positive light, which only fueled his ego. But the real turning point was when Stephanie started planning her wedding with Brad. Yep, you heard that right. They got engaged. And it wasn't a normal, happy announcement. It was the most Brad and Stephanie thing you could imagine. They posted a photo of her hand with the ring, captioned, "When you know, and tagged it with hashtags like Jacharine, Power Couple, and Chacha Better Than Fairy Tales. It was so over the top that James and I couldn't stop laughing. Of course, we found out later that Brad had proposed right after James told the family he was planning to propose to me. It was no coincidence. Brad couldn't stand the idea of James being in the spotlight, so he had to make his move first. And Stephanie? She probably loved the drama of it all. What really rubbed salt in the wound was how they acted afterward. When James proposed to me, we were over the moon. But as soon as we shared the news with his family, Brad and Stephanie made it about them. Stephanie kept saying things like, "Oh my gosh, maybe we'll all get married in the same year. That would be so fun." And Brad, with his usual smugness, said, "Guess we're just a family of overachievers, huh?" Stephanie's wedding planning became her entire personality. Every time we saw her, she'd find a way to bring it up, even if it wasn't relevant. If someone complimented my ring, she'd immediately start talking about her venue or her dress. And the worst part? She wasn't just showing off. She was subtly trying to undermine our plans. One time, she cornered me at a family dinner and said, "You're going to love wedding planning. It's so stressful but so worth it. Just make sure you don't let it take over your life." Oh, and I'd avoid pastel colors. They're so overdone. I hadn't even mentioned what colors I was considering. But guess what? I'd been leaning toward pastels. It was around this time that I started noticing how little Stephanie actually knew about Brad's past. She seemed completely unaware of his long list of exes and the drama he'd left behind. She talked about him like he was some kind of saint, saying things like, "Brad has such high standards. That's why he didn't settle down before me." I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. High standards? The guy had dated half the county and cheated on most of them. Stephanie was living in a bubble, completely blind to who Brad really was. And honestly, I couldn't wait for that bubble to burst. If she wanted to be part of the Brad show, she'd have to deal with everything that came with it. Little did she know, her big debut was just around the corner, and it wasn't going to go the way she thought. Okay, so let's get into the good part. By now, you probably have a pretty good idea of how Brad and Stephanie operate. They're not just the type of people who crave attention. They're the kind who need to dominate every single moment, even if it means ruining someone else's. And when it came to our engagement, they weren't content with just stealing the spotlight. No, they wanted to sabotage us completely. It started at our engagement party. James and I had planned this small get-together with close friends and family to celebrate the big news. Nothing fancy, just some food, music, and good vibes. Of course, we invited Brad and Stephanie because, well, they're family, and we figured it'd look bad if we didn't. In hindsight, I wish we'd just forgotten to send their invite. When they arrived, it was clear they weren't there to celebrate us. Stephanie showed up in this glittery dress that screamed, "Look at me," and Brad had his usual smug grin plastered across his face. Within 5 minutes, they were already working the room, talking to everyone about their engagement. It was exhausting. At one point, I overheard Stephanie telling one of James's aunts, "We're so excited to get married before the end of the year. It's going to be the wedding of the century." She conveniently forgot to mention that their engagement had only happened after James proposed to me. The real drama started about halfway through the night. I'd gone into the laundry room to grab some extra napkins, and as I was walking back, I heard voices coming from the hallway near our guest bedroom. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but I recognized Brad's voice, and, well, curiosity got me. I stopped in my tracks and listened. It was Brad and Stephanie, and they were whispering about our wedding. At first, I thought they were just gossiping or making snide remarks, which wouldn't have surprised me. But as I listened, I realized they weren't just talking trash. They were planning something. Brad was saying, "We need to make sure our wedding is the one everyone remembers. They think they're so perfect, but we'll show them who the real stars of this family are." Stephanie laughed and said, "Don't worry, babe. I've got a plan. We'll make her think we're on her side, like we're rooting for her. Then, when the wedding comes, we'll hit her where it hurts." I could feel my stomach twist as they kept talking. Their plan was bigger than I could have imagined. Stephanie wanted to get close to my bridesmaids, pretending to be friendly and helpful, only to stir up drama between them. She even said, "I'll make sure they're so busy fighting with each other, they won't even have time to focus on her." Brad chimed in with his own idea. He wanted to convince James's parents to pressure us into inviting more people to the wedding. People we didn't even know, just to throw off our guest list and create chaos. But the worst part? Stephanie had this grand finale planned. She wanted to give a surprise speech during the reception, pretending it was heartfelt, but actually using it to humiliate me in front of everyone. "I'll make her look like a total bridezilla," she said, laughing. "People will be talking about it for years." I stood there, frozen, as they went on and on. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They weren't just trying to ruin our day. They were trying to tear us down completely. And the way they talked about it, like it was some kind of game, made my blood boil. Who does that? When they finally left the hallway, I slipped back into the party like nothing had happened. I didn't want to cause a scene, not yet anyway. I spent the rest of the night trying to act normal, but inside I was fuming. As soon as everyone left, I sat James down and told him everything. At first, he thought I was exaggerating. "Maybe they were just joking," he said, always trying to see the best in people. But when I repeated their exact words, his face went pale. "They're unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. "Why can't they just leave us alone?" We spent hours talking about what to do. James wanted to confront them right away, but I stopped him. I knew Brad and Stephanie would deny everything and twist it around to make us look like the bad guys. That's their specialty, playing the victim. Instead, I suggested we let them think they were getting away with it. If they wanted to play dirty, we'd play smarter. We decided to act like we hadn't heard anything. James would keep his distance from Brad, and I'd be polite but distant with Stephanie. Meanwhile, I started making plans of my own. If they wanted to mess with our wedding, I'd make sure their wedding was the one nobody forgot, for all the wrong reasons. I started digging into Brad's past relationships. He had a long list of ex-girlfriends, and I figured some of them might still hold a grudge. It wasn't hard to find them. Social media made it easy. I reached out to a few, carefully explaining who I was and why I was contacting them. To my surprise, almost all of them were more than willing to talk. Turns out Brad had burned a lot of bridges, and these women were more than happy to help me expose him. One of them, Amy, told me about how Brad had cheated on her with 2 different women at the same time. "He made me feel like I was crazy for suspecting anything," she said. "I can't believe Stephanie is falling for his act." Another ex, Becca, laughed when I told her what I was planning. "Oh, I'm in," she said. "That guy deserves whatever's coming to him." Within a week, I'd assembled a small army of Brad's scorned exes. We created a group chat to coordinate everything. And let me tell you, these women were hilarious. The way they roasted Brad was better than any stand-up routine I'd ever seen. But we weren't just there to laugh. We had a mission. And when Brad and Stephanie's wedding day rolled around, we were ready. By the time their wedding invitations went out, I knew everything I needed to know. Stephanie was oblivious to Brad's history. She genuinely thought he was some kind of misunderstood prince. I almost felt bad for her. But then I remembered how she'd laughed about humiliating me at my own wedding. Whatever sympathy I might have had disappeared. Their wedding was set for a month before ours, and it was shaping up to be as over-the-top as you'd expect. They bragged about their fancy venue, their guest list, and how perfect everything was going to be. Stephanie even made a point of telling me how stressful planning a wedding was, as if I hadn't already started working on mine. "Don't worry, Kelly," she said with a fake smile. "I'm sure your wedding will be cute in its own way." I just smiled back, knowing she had no idea what was coming. Brad and Stephanie wanted to play dirty? Fine. But they were about to learn that messing with us was the biggest mistake they'd ever made. Alright, so let me walk you through Brad and Stephanie's wedding day. Because not only was it the most satisfying train wreck I've ever witnessed, but I was there to see it all unfold. Their wedding was everything I hoped it would be. A total disaster, but one where they couldn't run away from the mess they'd created. James and I showed up, acting like the supportive family members we were supposed to be. I wore a simple dress, and James looked sharp in his suit. We didn't want to draw attention to ourselves, but I had a hard time keeping a straight face knowing what was about to go down. The venue was packed with people Brad and Stephanie had been bragging about inviting, colleagues, extended family, friends, and of course, Stephanie's parents' wealthy social circle. The place was decked out to the nines, massive floral arrangements, glittering chandeliers, and the kind of over-the-top decor that screamed, "We spent too much money on this." Stephanie's dad had clearly bankrolled the entire thing, and Brad, predictably, was basking in the attention like he was some self-made mogul. James and I took our seats near the back, nodding and smiling politely to other guests while waiting for the show to start. The ceremony began with the usual grand entrance of the bridal party, and then Stephanie made her big appearance. Her dress sparkled so much it was borderline blinding, and she walked down the aisle with a smug smile, clearly loving every second of being the center of attention. Everything was going smoothly, well, for the first 10 minutes. The officiant welcomed everyone, and then Brad and Stephanie stood side by side, holding hands and beaming. That's when Amy made her move. Amy stood up from her seat near the back of the room, dressed in a sleek, elegant gown that wouldn't have been out of place in a bridal party. At first, the guests thought she was part of the ceremony, maybe someone bringing a reading or a blessing. But then she walked straight up to Brad and Stephanie, stopping right in front of them. "Brad," she said, her voice clear and steady, "before you make any promises today, I think everyone here deserves to know the kind of promises you've broken." You could hear a pin drop, Brad's face drained of all color, and Stephanie's brow furrowed as she tried to figure out what was going on. Before anyone could stop her, Amy pulled out an envelope and handed it to Brad. He hesitated, but Stephanie snatched it and tore it open, pulling out a series of handwritten letters. "What is this?" Stephanie snapped, flipping through the pages. "They're love letters," Amy explained, her voice calm but cutting. "Letters Brad wrote to me while we were dating. Oh, and to several other women, while he was also dating me." The crowd erupted into whispers. Stephanie's hands shook as she skimmed one of the letters, her eyes narrowing with every word. Brad tried to grab the envelope, but Amy held firm. "You might want to let her finish," she said with a cold smile. "It gets better." Becca, the second ex, stood up then, striding confidently down the aisle. She, too, was dressed impeccably, and she held an envelope of her own. "Hi, Stephanie," Becca said sweetly, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. "I'm Becca. I dated Brad for about 6 months. During that time, he told me he was saving up for our future. Turns out he was just borrowing money from me to take another girl out on dates." Stephanie's jaw dropped. "Is this true?" she hissed at Brad. "How many of these are there?" Brad stammered. It's not what it looks like. They're lying." One by one, more of Brad's exes stood up, each carrying their own envelope. Lisa walked down the aisle next, her heels clicking loudly against the marble floor. She handed her envelope to Stephanie, who was now visibly shaking. "You don't know me," Lisa said, "but I know Brad all too well. He promised me the world while he was sneaking off to see other women. Here's a list of their names. He gave them cute little nicknames in his phone so I wouldn't figure it out." At this point, the officiant looked completely lost, and the guests were openly gossiping. Phones were out, capturing every second of the chaos. Stephanie's parents looked horrified, whispering furiously to each other, while Brad's parents sat frozen, staring at their son as if seeing him for the first time. Danielle was the last to stand up. She didn't have an envelope, but carried a single sheet of paper. "This one's my favorite," she said, holding up what turned out to be a printed screenshot of a dating app conversation. "This is Brad matching with me on Tinder, while he was already living with one of his exes. Recognize this, Brad?" The crowd gasped. Stephanie threw the envelopes onto the floor, her face red with fury. "How could you?" she spat at Brad. "Are these women lying? Or is this just a giant coincidence?" Brad looked like a deer caught in headlights. "I can explain," he stammered. "They're all just jealous. They're trying to ruin my life." "Oh, please," Amy snapped. "You ruined your own life, Brad. We're just here to make sure no one else gets hurt." Despite the chaos, Stephanie didn't storm off. No, she stood there, fuming, glaring at Brad like she wanted to murder him. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth. "We'll deal with this later. Let's just finish the ceremony." The officiant awkwardly cleared his throat and tried to regain control of the room. Shall we continue?" he asked, glancing nervously at the bride and groom. Brad nodded weakly, while Stephanie forced a tight-lipped smile. The guests were still whispering, and a few even left, clearly too uncomfortable to stick around. But the ceremony limped on, the vows rushed and robotic, and the atmosphere completely ruined. When it was finally over, the reception began, but no one cared about the couple anymore. The gossip was all about Brad's past. Every table was buzzing with conversation about the exes, the letters, and the lies. People kept glancing at Brad and Stephanie, who were doing their best to act like everything was fine. It wasn't. James and I stayed just long enough to enjoy the awkwardness before quietly slipping out. On the way home, we laughed until our sides hurt. Brad and Stephanie had wanted their wedding to be unforgettable, and in a way, they got their wish, just not the way they'd planned. After Brad and Stephanie's wedding disaster, you'd think they'd crawl into a hole and try to lay low for a while, but nope, they came out swinging, desperate to figure out how their perfect day had turned into a complete circus. I mean, I'll give them credit. They didn't pack up and leave town out of embarrassment, but honestly, maybe they should have. The first few days after the wedding were pretty quiet on our end. James and I carried on as usual, trying not to laugh every time we thought about what had happened. We didn't hear a peep from Brad or Stephanie, but the group chats were buzzing. Apparently, everyone in their social circle was talking about the exes, the letters, and the sheer audacity of the whole thing. Stephanie's parents were furious, not at Brad, which they should have been, but at the humiliation they felt in front of their fancy friends. By midweek, the silence broke. Stephanie started posting vague, passive-aggressive comments on social media about fake people and how she'd never let anyone ruin her happiness. Brad, on the other hand, wasn't subtle at all. He posted a whole rant about how some jealous, bitter women had tried to sabotage him and Stephanie, but failed because love always wins. The comment section was a mix of people supporting him, mainly his clueless friends, and others hinting that maybe he wasn't as innocent as he claimed. James and I kept our heads down, liking a few generic posts here and there to avoid suspicion. But then, Brad and Stephanie started sniffing around. It started with a random call from Brad. James answered it while we were making dinner, putting the phone on speaker. So, Brad started awkwardly, "How'd you guys enjoy the wedding?" James gave me a look but played it cool. "It was nice," he said. "The venue was beautiful." "Yeah, thanks," Brad replied, his tone shifting. "So, you guys didn't notice anything weird? Like during the ceremony?" "Weird? No, why?" James asked, perfectly innocent. "Oh, nothing," Brad said quickly. "Just thought you might have heard some rumors or something. You know, people can be jealous." I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. Brad was fishing, and James wasn't taking the bait. "I didn't hear anything," James said casually. "Everything seemed fine to me." Brad let out a forced laugh. Yeah, that's what I thought. Anyway, see you around." He hung up, and James and I burst out laughing. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the next few days, Brad and Stephanie started asking other family members if they knew anything about the exes showing up. Word got back to us that they were convinced someone had orchestrated it, but had no idea who. Stephanie apparently suspected one of her bridesmaids, but Brad had his sights set on James and me. "They think we did it," I told James one night after his sister Emma called to update us. "Let them think it," James said, smirking. "They can't prove anything." For a while, it felt like we were in the clear. That is, until James's parents called and asked us to come over for dinner. Now, let me tell you something about James's parents. They've always tried to stay neutral when it comes to Brad and James's sibling drama, but I could tell from the moment we walked into their house that they were gearing up for a serious conversation. Dinner was tense. Normally, his mom would be chatting about her garden or their latest Netflix obsession, but she barely said a word. His dad was equally quiet, which is rare for him. After dinner, his mom cleared her throat and said, "So, we've been hearing some things about Brad's wedding." James played dumb. "Oh? What kind of things?" She sighed. "Brad and Stephanie are saying someone might have had something to do with what happened during the ceremony. They think it was you two." I felt James tense next to me, but I decided to take the lead. "Why would they think that?" I asked, keeping my tone light. His dad frowned. "Well, you have to admit, it's a little suspicious. Those women showing up, it's not something that just happens, and you've never exactly gotten along with Brad." James exhaled and leaned forward. "All right, fine, it was us." His mom gasped, and his dad just stared at him, his jaw tightening. "You're serious?" his dad asked. "Yes," I said. "We planned it, but before you get mad, you need to know why." We explained everything. How I'd overheard Brad and Stephanie plotting to humiliate us at our wedding, how they wanted to ruin my relationships with my bridesmaids, and make a spectacle out of us during our reception. I told them about the awful things they said, how they laughed about it like it was some big joke, and how I knew we had to stop them before they got the chance. James chimed in saying, "We didn't want to do this, but they left us no choice. They've been trying to one-up us and tear us down for years. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting our day." His mom looked horrified, not at us, but at the idea that Brad and Stephanie would do something so cruel. "Are you sure they were really planning all that?" she asked. "I heard them say it," I said firmly. "Every word. They didn't care about how it would hurt us. They just wanted to make our wedding a joke." His dad rubbed his temples, clearly trying to process everything. "You shouldn't have stooped to their level," he finally said. "But I can't say I blame you." His mom nodded slowly. It's hard to hear, but if what you're saying is true, I understand why you did it. I just wish things hadn't come to this. The conversation ended on a tense but understanding note. They didn't condone what we did, but they couldn't deny that Brad and Stephanie had pushed us to the edge. We left their house feeling a little lighter, knowing they weren't going to defend Brad this time. Over the next few days, things settled down. Brad and Stephanie were still sniffing around for answers, but James's parents didn't give them any hints. Emma called us to say their mom had pulled Brad aside and told him to stop harassing the family about the wedding. Apparently, Brad had the nerve to act offended, saying he was the victim, but she shut him down pretty quickly. As for Stephanie, she started posting less and less on social media, and when she did, it was all overly cheerful, like she was trying to prove how happy she was. But the cracks were starting to show. A mutual friend told us she'd been complaining to anyone who'd listen about how someone ruined her big day, and how unfair it was. Meanwhile, her parents were pressuring Brad to fix things, because they didn't want their family name dragged through the mud. James and I, on the other hand, were focused on our wedding. With Brad and Stephanie's chaos behind us, we could finally enjoy the planning process. We kept everything low-key and intimate, making sure only the people we trusted were involved. And the best part? We didn't have to worry about Brad and Stephanie showing up. But of course, this wouldn't be the last time they tried to insert themselves into our lives. They had one last trick up their sleeve, and while it didn't go the way they planned, it made for an unforgettable finale. It started with an odd phone call. James got a message from an old coworker he hadn't spoken to in years, congratulating him on the wedding and saying, "I'm looking forward to seeing you both there." Confused, James called him back and asked how he knew about the wedding. Turns out, Brad and Stephanie had somehow gotten hold of our guest list and venue details and sent out fake invitations under other people's names. At first, we didn't even believe it. Who does that? But when a couple of other guests mentioned they'd received duplicate RSVPs with slightly different details, we knew Brad and Stephanie were behind it. Their plan was obvious: sneak in under fake names, cause a scene, and ruin our day. Thankfully, we were prepared. After Brad and Stephanie's wedding fiasco, we decided to take every precaution to keep them out of ours. We'd hired security for the venue, and every guest was required to check in with ID at the door. It felt a little extreme at first, but now we were grateful we'd gone the extra mile. On the day of the wedding, everything started off perfectly. James and I were both excited and nervous in that giddy pre-wedding way. Guests began arriving, and security was doing an amazing job keeping things organized. It was shaping up to be the best day of our lives. And then they showed up. I didn't see it happen myself, but I heard about it from our wedding planner, who came rushing over to me with wide eyes. "We have a situation at the entrance," she said. "There's a couple trying to get in, claiming to be family." My stomach dropped. "Is it Brad and Stephanie?" I asked. She nodded. James and I had already agreed to let security handle them, so I told her to stick to the plan. "Just make sure they don't get in," I said. "We're not dealing with them today." Meanwhile, at the entrance, Brad was putting on his best performance. Dressed in a sharp suit, he was trying to convince the security team that he was James's brother and had every right to be there. "This is family business," he argued, his voice growing louder with every word. "You can't keep me out of my own brother's wedding." Stephanie stood next to him in a sleek dress, arms crossed and looking furious. "We're on the guest list," she snapped. "This is ridiculous." The head of security, a no-nonsense guy we'd hired specifically for situations like this, didn't budge. "Your names aren't on the list," he said firmly, "and without an invitation or proper identification, I can't let you in." Brad's face turned red, and he launched into a rant about how family doesn't need an invitation. Stephanie, meanwhile, completely lost her cool. "This isn't over!" she screamed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the security guard. "You'll regret this." The guard calmly escorted them back to their car, ignoring their threats and protests. By the time they finally drove off, half the guests were already inside, oblivious to the drama unfolding outside. The rest of the day was perfect. I mean, absolutely perfect. Once James and I were standing at the altar, nothing else mattered. Surrounded by friends and family who genuinely loved and supported us, we celebrated our relationship and the life we were building together. The ceremony was beautiful, emotional, and exactly what we'd dreamed of. A few days after the wedding, word started getting around about what had happened at the entrance. Some guests had seen Brad and Stephanie being turned away and had no problem sharing the details. The story spread fast, and people were eating it up. Apparently, Brad and Stephanie had been ranting to anyone who would listen about how unfair it was that they weren't allowed in. But instead of getting sympathy, they just made themselves look even more pathetic. It didn't take long for the cracks in their relationship to show. Stephanie, who had always prided herself on appearances, was mortified by how they'd been humiliated. Twice now. About a month after the wedding, we heard from a mutual friend that Stephanie had finally had enough. She'd dug a little deeper into Brad's past and found out just how much he'd lied to her about his finances, his relationships, and even his role in their own wedding planning. Apparently, she confronted him in a spectacular blowout fight, packed her things, and left him. From what we heard, Brad was devastated, or as devastated as someone like him could be. He tried calling her, messaging her, even showing up at her parents' house, but she was done. For the first time in his life, Brad was facing the consequences of his action, and there was no one left to clean up his mess. As for James and me, we're happier than ever. Our wedding was everything we'd hoped for, and we've spent the months since enjoying married life without Brad and Stephanie's drama weighing us down. Cutting them out of our lives was the best decision we ever made. They tried to ruin our happiness, but all they did was destroy their own. Sometimes poetic justice isn't just satisfying, it's absolutely necessary.